Solomon Briggs was 40 years old when his wife put his father's watch in a box with 17 other items and drove it to an estate auction house on a Tuesday morning without telling him. The watch was a 1967 Rolex Submariner in matte black dial, reference 5513, that his father Ernest had worn every day from the year Solomon was born until the year Ernest died, and which had been left to Solomon not in a will. Ernest had not written a will, but in the specific and deliberate way that certain things are passed between certain fathers and certain sons. Which is to say that Ernest had taken it off his wrist the morning before. He went into the hospital for the last time and had set it on Solomon's kitchen table without ceremony, and Solomon had understood without a word, being exchanged what the gesture meant and what the watch was and what he was being asked to hold. Miriam had priced it at $50. The auction house had agreed. A man named Ellis Garrett had purchased it on a Thursday afternoon for the asking price, no bidding, cash. What Miriam did not know, what she had organized her entire plan around not needing to know, was that Ellis Garrett was not a stranger. Ellis Garrett had been Solomon's father's closest friend for 31 years. He had recognized the watch the moment he saw it in the auction case and had known immediately and without question that something was wrong. Because Ernest Briggs had told Ellis explicitly in the last months of his life that the Submariner was going to Solomon and Solomon alone, and that it was the most important physical thing Ernest owned, not because of what it cost, but because of what it meant. Ellis had purchased the watch to protect it. Then he had called Solomon. And then, in the days that followed, Ellis Garrett, who had spent 40 years building a private equity firm out of a one-room office in Richmond, Virginia, and who was worth $112 million by any conservative accounting, had begun to understand the full shape of what Miriam had done and what Solomon had never said about his own circumstances. And he had made a decision that would redirect the next decade of Solomon's life entirely. What happened next would cost Miriam everything she thought she had already escaped with. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Solomon Briggs had grown up in Richmond, Virginia, in a house on Semmes Avenue in Manchester that his father Ernest had purchased in 1978 for $32,000 and had spent the subsequent decade improving, not with contractors, but with his own hands, and the hands of whichever friends he could persuade to give up a Saturday in exchange for food and good conversation. Ernest Briggs had been a machinist for 29 years at a precision manufacturing plant in South Richmond, and the thing about a man who spent his working life making parts fit together with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch was that he brought that same standard of precision to everything else. To the way he spoke, to the way he maintained things, to the way he chose the people he trusted, and the weight he placed on that trust once it was given. He wore the Rolex because a colleague had given it to him in 1967 in exchange for a debt Ernest had forgiven, and he wore it not as an ornament, but as a record of a transaction between two men who had kept their word to each other, which was, in Ernest's view, the only transaction that meant anything. Solomon had absorbed this view completely and had applied it to his own work in ways that were not always visible. He was a patent attorney, had been for 12 years, working from a small firm in the Fan District that specialized in mechanical and industrial intellectual property, the kind of work that required understanding both the legal architecture of protection and the physical mechanics of what was being protected. He was good at it in the way his father had been good at machining, which was to say he worked with precision and patience and did not mistake the appearance of a thing for the substance of it. He drove a Honda Accord with 140,000 miles on it and wore suits that fit well because they had been tailored once and maintained since, and he had never felt the need to perform prosperity at the expense of building it. His colleagues considered him methodical. His clients considered him thorough. Neither group had any idea what was in the account held by the LLC he had formed at the advice of his financial advisor 8 years ago, which was precisely the way Solomon had designed it. He had met Miriam in 2016 at a bar association event he had attended because his law partner had insisted, which was the same reason he attended most social events. She had been in residential real estate then and had the confident, polished manner of someone who had learned to read rooms and calibrate her presentation accordingly. She had seemed, in the first year, genuinely interested in his work, the technical puzzles of it, the way a well-constructed patent claim was like a precisely toleranced part designed to fit exactly and exclude everything that did not belong. She had asked intelligent questions. He had believed the questions were driven by curiosity. He had come to understand, later, that they were driven by a different kind of calculation, the kind a person runs when they are trying to understand the dimensions of what they might eventually claim. What changed was not sudden. It was the slow movement of a person who has decided where they are going and is no longer particularly interested in the place they are leaving. The questions stopped. The evenings became separate. She traveled with colleagues whose names he did not recognize and returned from those trips with a quality of refreshed indifference that told him something was being replenished elsewhere. He noticed each of these things in the order they arrived and placed them in the same category: information not yet actionable, requiring patience and the accumulation of sufficient clarity before any response was warranted. His father had taught him this. A machinist who reacted to the first sign of vibration without understanding its source destroyed the part he was trying to save. You listened to the vibration until you understood it, and then you acted with precision. The watch had sat in a velvet-lined box on the shelf in Solomon's home office since the morning Ernest set it on the kitchen table. Solomon had not worn it. He had not displayed it. He had not described it to Miriam in any terms that would have conveyed what it was, which he now understood had been its own kind of error, not because Miriam would have honored the value he described, but because the absence of that description had left space for her to assign her own, which turned out to be $50 and a Tuesday morning. The coffee grew cold beside him the morning after Ellis called. Solomon sat in his office for a long time, without moving after the call ended. Ellis had described finding the watch in the auction case. He had described recognizing it immediately: the matte black dial, the lack of crown guards, the specific patina that a watch develops over decades of daily wear by the same wrist. He had described his certainty that it was Ernest's. He had said, in the quiet way Ellis spoke when he was choosing his words with the same care Ernest had chosen his parts, "I'm bringing it to you. I need to understand what happened. And then, after a pause, I also need you to tell me some things you have apparently not told me." Solomon had been aware for the better part of a year that the marriage was ending. He had been aware because Miriam had made it clear, not through cruelty initially, but through the incremental withdrawal of investment that precedes most endings, a quality of absence that arrived gradually, like a structural load that builds past the point a beam can bear without the beam announcing the failure in advance. He had noticed. He had documented. His hands did not shake. He had not known about the watch. That had been the piece outside his preparation, the thing that arrived before he was ready, and he had sat with the knowledge of it for 2 days before he called his attorney. What the preceding 10 months had given him was everything else. He had accessed the joint account records and found what he was looking for: a pattern of withdrawals, 23 of them over 14 months, totaling $68,000, routed to an account he did not have documentation for, but that his attorney would later obtain through discovery. He had found, through an accountant recommended by his law partner, evidence that Miriam had filed amended returns on 2 prior joint tax years, using a preparer Solomon had never met. Amendments that had redirected a combined refund of $12,000 into an account in her name alone. He had found a lease agreement, signed 3 months earlier, for an apartment in Scott's Addition that listed Miriam as the sole tenant, and that had been signed with a month that corresponded exactly to a weekend she had told him she was visiting her sister in Charlottesville. He had built a folder. He had named it in the precise and unembellished way of a man who had spent 12 years naming patent claims. Simply, documentation. Then he had opened it on his desk and called his attorney, Claire Whitmore, who practiced family law from an office 2 blocks from Solomon's firm, and who had been recommended to him 3 years ago for estate planning, and who had, when Solomon explained what he was bringing her, listened without interruption, and then said, "Bring me everything you have. I'll tell you what it means." Claire Whitmore was 53 years old, lean and precise, with the manner of a woman who had been given bad information by overconfident people so many times that she had developed a near-perfect instinct for distinguishing between what a client knew and what a client thought they knew. She reviewed Solomon's documentation folder over 2 days and came back to him on a Wednesday morning with a legal pad covered in notes and a directness he found, under the circumstances, genuinely refreshing. "The withdrawals are documentable as marital waste under Virginia law," she said. "The amended returns are potentially fraudulent. I want a forensic accountant on those before we file anything. The apartment lease is useful context, but not independently actionable." She set her legal pad down. "What I want to know about is the LLC," Solomon told her. She was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know about it." "No," he said. "She has never asked about your finances in any systematic way. It was not a question. She assumed," Solomon said. "She assumed the Honda and the firm's salary and the modest address were the full picture." Claire picked up her pen. "Then what she's planning to take and what you actually have are 2 different inventories." She wrote something. "Good. Let's control the sequencing." Ellis Garrett arrived at Solomon's office on a Saturday morning with a watch in a cloth bag and a quality of grief that was not performed. He was 69 years old, still sharp in every important way, with the kind of stillness that accumulates in men who have made serious decisions under serious conditions for long enough that stillness becomes their default operating mode. He set the cloth bag on Solomon's desk. Solomon opened it. He held the watch and did not say anything for a moment. He set it down. Ellis said, "Tell me what happened." Solomon told him everything. Not just the watch, but the full account, the withdrawals, the apartment, the amended returns, the folder he had built, what Claire was preparing. He spoke without inflection. The way he wrote patent claims, precisely, completely, without ornament or self-pity. Ellis listened with the specific quality of attention that Ernest had possessed, which was the kind that does not categorize what it is hearing until it has heard all of it, and which does not offer a response before the full weight of what has been said has settled. When Solomon finished, Ellis was quiet for a long time. A full minute, perhaps longer. He looked at the watch on the desk between them. "Your father told me 3 months before he died," Ellis said, "that you were the best thing he had ever made." He used that word. Made. He looked at Solomon directly. Ernest used precise language. He didn't say built or raised. He said made, because it meant the whole thing, the materials and the process and the result. He picked up the watch and held it briefly, the way a man holds something that has passed through wrong hands and arrived back where it belongs, and then set it down in front of Solomon. "I want you to tell me about the LLC. I want you to tell me what you have built, and then I want you to tell me what you need." He folded his hands on the desk. "Because I am going to help you. Not as a transaction, as an obligation to a man who is no longer here to help you himself." Solomon looked at the watch for a moment. Then he put it on his wrist for the first time since his father had set it on the kitchen table. He did not explain why. Ellis did not ask. Then Solomon began to speak. What Solomon told Ellis about over the following 2 hours was a portfolio of 6 mechanical and industrial patents he had developed and filed independently over the preceding 11 years. 3 in partnership with former clients who had assigned partial ownership to Solomon in lieu of fees during periods when those clients were cash-constrained. And 3 developed entirely on his own from technical problems he had encountered in the course of his patent work and had believed could be solved, and had solved, and had filed, and had been licensing quietly through the LLC to manufacturing firms in the Mid-Atlantic region. The annual licensing revenue was $104,000. It had been accumulating in the LLC for 6 years. The LLC held $480,000 in retained earnings in addition to the licensing stream. Miriam had never been told about the patents. She had never asked what a patent attorney did outside of billing hours. She had assumed the Honda was evidence of limitation rather than preference. She had been planning her exit for over a year based on an inventory that was fundamentally wrong. Ellis listened to all of this. Then he said, quietly and without drama, "I want to buy a license for the 3rd patent. The one on the tolerance compensation mechanism. My firm has been looking for something exactly like it for a manufacturing subsidiary we acquired 2 years ago. I want a 10-year exclusive license for that patent. I want you to have your attorney value it properly, and I want to pay what it is worth." Claire Whitmore retained a patent valuation specialist named Howard Gaines, who spent 3 weeks reviewing the technology, the existing licensing agreements, the market for the application, and the manufacturing subsidiary's projected revenue over 10 years. His valuation for a 10-year exclusive license was $9.8 million. Ellis read the valuation and said, "I'll pay 10. Solomon said nothing for a moment. Ellis said, "Your father forgave a debt for me once. This is not the same thing, but it is in the same category." Solomon signed the agreement. The wire arrived on a Thursday. It was $10 million, exactly. Miriam was served 3 weeks later. The process server found her at the apartment in Scott's Addition at 8:40 in the morning. The dissolution filing was accompanied by Claire Whitmore's financial disclosure, which listed, for the first time, the full picture: the patents, the LLC, the retained earnings, the newly executed license agreement and its value. It also included the forensic accountant's findings on the amended tax returns, which the accountant had characterized in plain and unambiguous language as fraudulent. Claire had filed a copy of those findings with the Virginia Department of Taxation the same morning. The mediation took place 5 weeks later in a neutral conference room at a law office in downtown Richmond. Miriam arrived composed, with an attorney Solomon did not recognize, and sat across the table with the expression of a woman who had spent the previous 5 weeks being told things she had not anticipated. The financial disclosure had been read. The patent valuation had been read. The license agreement had been read. She had been told by her own attorney what the forensic accountant's report meant for her exposure on the amended returns. She understood the shape of what she had walked into. She had not understood, until she sat across from Solomon and the full documentation was on the table between them, that the watch had not been a loss. The watch had been the thing that completed the circuit. That put Ellis Garrett in the auction house. That put Ellis Garrett on the phone. That put $10 million in an LLC that would now be fully visible in a Virginia divorce proceeding. traceable and documented and protected by the kind of legal architecture that 12 years of patent work had taught Solomon to construct with precision. She looked at the watch. It was on Solomon's wrist. He had put it on the morning of the mediation for the first time since his father had set it on the kitchen table. He wore it the way Ernest had worn it, not as an ornament but as a record. Miriam's attorney began speaking about settlement positions. Claire responded. The numbers were reviewed. The forensic accountant's findings were discussed. The marital waste was calculated. The amended return exposure was noted. At no point during any of this did Solomon raise his voice or deviate from the evenness he had maintained since the morning Ellis had called. He was the same man he had been on every Tuesday when Miriam had not bothered to look at what was actually in front of her. "You priced my father's watch at $50, Solomon said, when her attorney had finished the opening position. He did not say it with heat. He said it the way his father had said things, with the precision of a man who had spent his working life understanding that words, like tolerances, meant exactly as much as they were measured to mean, and not one fraction more. You priced it at $50 and sold it on a Tuesday, and didn't mention it." He looked at her steadily. "The man who bought it knew what it was. He knew because my father told him. My father told him because my father told the people he trusted the truth about the things that mattered." He set his hands flat on the table. "That is the difference between us. I have always known what things were worth. You never asked." He nodded to Claire. He stood. He walked out of the room. The hallway was wide and quiet. The elevator opened before he pressed the button. Outside, the Richmond afternoon was cool, and the James River was 2 blocks west, and Solomon could smell it if he turned his face in that direction. Which he did, briefly, before walking to his car. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. 14 months later, Solomon Briggs was sitting in the workshop he had built in the back of the house on Semmes Avenue, the house Ernest had bought in 1978, which Solomon had purchased from the estate at fair value in the year after his father's death, and which he had been renovating slowly, in the order of priority that the house itself seemed to suggest, with the patience of a man who understood that good work did not have a deadline, only a standard. He had started with the foundation, as his father would have, inspected it, reinforced 2 sections of the sill plate that had softened with age, treated the wood and given it time to cure before moving upward. Then, the roof. Then, the electrical, which he had contracted to a man his father had trusted, and whose son had taken over the business, and who worked with the same precision the father had. He was in no hurry. The house had waited decades for this attention, and it would not begrudge him the time required to do it correctly. The workshop smelled of machine oil and cedar shavings. On the workbench in front of him was a mechanical clock movement he had been restoring for 3 months. A project that had begun as a distraction and had become something he understood he needed. Something that required precision and patience, and the willingness to work with parts so small that the margin for error was not visible to the naked eye, where the only way to know if a thing was right was to hold it to a standard and measure honestly and adjust accordingly. It suited him completely. It had always suited him. The LLC had been restructured after the settlement, with Leonard's guidance and Claire's oversight, into a cleaner vehicle for the patent portfolio and the license revenue. The $10 million license payment had been invested conservatively, in a mix that Leonard had described as boring and excellent, which Solomon had taken as the highest possible recommendation. The 3 remaining patents were still generating their combined licensing income. He had filed 2 new applications in the preceding year, both arising from technical problems he had encountered in client work. both assigned partially to the clients in exchange for the kind of long-term equity arrangements that his father would have recognized as the correct way to do business between people who trusted each other. Miriam had relocated to Northern Virginia. Her attorney had negotiated a settlement that recovered what the forensic accountant had documented, and nothing more. The Virginia Department of Taxation had concluded its review of the amended returns. Miriam had resolved that matter through a combination of repayment and penalties that her attorney had characterized, in the understated language of legal professionals, as significant. She had moved on. Solomon had noted this through the clean and impersonal filter of finality, and had thought about it once, and then moved on himself. Ellis Garrett came to Richmond 4 times a year now, for dinners at the house on Semmes Avenue that lasted past midnight and covered everything from the manufacturing subsidiary's production results to the question of what Ernest would have thought of various decisions Solomon had made or was considering. Ellis had known Ernest for 31 years. He carried that knowledge the way Ernest had carried the watch, not as an ornament but as a record of something real that deserved to be honored by being used. The watch was on Solomon's wrist. It was always on his wrist now. He wore it the way Ernest had worn it, which was simply, without commentary, the way a man wears a thing that means something true. He set down the tool he was holding and looked at the clock movement on the bench. Every part in its correct place, every tolerance within specification. The whole thing held together by the precision of each individual piece doing exactly what it was made to do. Nothing more and nothing less, which was the only kind of structure that had ever held for long. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.